Hey everybody. So tonight's topic is going to be lights and lighting in the Unreal Engine. Lights and lighting are pretty easy compared to a lot of the other topics. There are a lot of new settings and things that have changed from Unreal 3 to Unreal 4, and we'll go over a lot of those tonight. Uh, so let's go ahead and get started. There's four types of lights available to us in Unreal, and we can find them in our modes panel under lights. We have directional lights, point lights, spotlights, and skylights. And we'll go over each of these, we'll go over their settings, and we'll talk about some other things like light painting, shadows, and shadow maps, or light maps. So the first one we have is a directional light, and I actually have one outside of this cave that we're in here. And a directional light essentially will what a directional light is for is to simulate light from a source that is infinitely far away. So this is used to simulate daylight more often than not. Its location in your level doesn't matter. You can put it wherever you want. It can be down below uh, it can be below the plane of geometry you have. It can be like anywhere you want. Scaling it won't do anything to it. Rotating it, however, will. So here we see this little arrow here coming out of it. And this arrow is what actually determines the direction the light is coming from. So if I position the camera, we look up and we see we actually have a big fiery ball of light in the sky there representing our sun. Um, and I can rotate this around to change where the position of that is. I think for right now, I'm going to point it so it's coming in this little hole I've got set up over here. I'm going to move this a little bit to make it easier to line these guys up. There we go. Um, all right, so let's talk about some of the settings that we've got for our directional light. We've got our standard transforms. Um, Mobility are new settings. This is a new thing that's been added in Unreal 4. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Um, so underneath in our we have our actual light settings, and our intensity always set to a default of 1. One's a pretty good default for most things. We can bump this up to 5, and we'll see how much more intense that is. Uh, it gets really bright really fast. So a lot of this is going to depend on what you're making, what time of day it is, the angle of the light. We can actually do this a different way. We can do it based on temperature um, rather than intensity. So 6500, this is temperature in Kelvin. So if you're familiar with Kelvin, or if you are an astronomy fan, this will make perfect sense to you. I think our sun's about, it's 8,000 Kelvin. Anyway, so we're gonna uncheck use temperature, and we're just gonna use our standard intensity. Light color is pretty self-explanatory. It's the color of the light. You click on You can either click on the color picker here and select, and generally with light, you want to stay in this middle area here. Um, like light, especially from our sun, has some color in it, but not a lot. Hence the reason it appears white. I'm just going to try and get this back to someplace yellow, and then get the saturation down. Most of this, again, is going to depend on what it is you're trying to do. Generally, with lighting in games, realism isn't always what you're shooting for, so much as something that gives a good mood and something that looks good. Makes your shadows look good, has neat effects that you like, those kind of things. So these under here, affects the world is exactly what it sounds like. If this is off, this light literally won't do anything. We can have it cast shadows or not cast shadows. Indirect lighting intensity is our global illumination, and this is a value from 0 to 1. So 0, there's no GI, and 1, the light will carry as much color information with it as it can. So modulated shadows, I'm not going to really talk about. They're for mobile. There's plenty of documentation about them in the documentation for a directional light. So if you're curious about that, you can go ahead and check it out. Uh, the atmosphere sunlight, this actually just affects the, oh, wow, that's awesome. Um, this actually just affects the color of the sky, basically having the light appear as though it's passing through a thick layer of atmosphere, in order to give it this kind of nice blue color we have here. We're going to skip over minimum roughness for now. Shadow bias. If you're getting chunky shadows on things, like if the edges are kind of pixely, these actually look all right. See if we got any over here that are looking kind of gross. If you have some gross looking shadows and they're not looking very good, you can start to play with the shadow bias a little bit, moving it up and down to smooth out the edges of the shadows. Generally, you're going to want kind of what I have here. This light hasn't been built yet, but this is actually doing a pretty good job of the preview. This is a nice fade from darker areas that are completely occluded to where the shadow eventually fades out. This is for whether or not something will cast shadows through a translucent object. So, for example, if you've got a big uh, like glass vase and it's full of water, uh, and light shines through it, you could either have that just cast a regular shadow as though that were an opaque object, or you can check that and then it will do its best to simulate light passing through a translucent object. And this works for water too. So dynamic indirect lighting doesn't actually do anything yet, as of now, so we can ignore that. Cast static shadows, exactly what it sounds like. Should it help in the generation of static shadow maps? Cast dynamic shadows, also pretty self-explanatory. Will this cast shadows on a dynamic object? You know, a player, any moving object. And then the effect translucent lighting is just whether or not the light should pass through translucent objects in the same manner that light generally does in real life. I haven't actually played with that yet, so I don't know how well it works. Anyway, the rest of the stuff we have here, this is the rest of this that we're really going to worry about, is just for light shafts. And so if I get the camera in the right spot, there we go. So we've got our light shafts coming in, and you're going to see this if you have the light shafts turned on. I'm going to turn the bloom off because that's crazy. Maybe, yeah. Anyway, if you have light shafts turned on, then anytime your light source is partially occluded, you're going to get God rays coming from that. Generally, not quite this intense though. That's pretty crazy. Um, I'm going to turn that down even farther if I can. Oh, down here, I click this little arrow here. These are the advanced options. The light shaft override direction here is just for changing the light shafts to come from a different direction than your actual light source is. I don't recommend doing that. It looks really weird, especially if the shafts and the light source are both visible at the same time. What you're going to see is not going to make sense. You know, it will look like it was a mistake. You can, however, use it to some effect. Like, for example, I could probably use it here. If you were never going to actually be able to see the light source itself, I could probably use something like that here to get the light shafts to appear exactly the way that I want. But they're okay for now. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So the next kind of light we have is a point light. And you can just grab any of these and drag them into your scene. And point lights, much like how they're represented here, basically simulate light bulbs. And point lights have a number of components. So we've got our intensity, and for these kinds of lights, the intensity is measured in lumens, which if you have ever bought a light bulb, you might, or a physics student, you might be familiar with. It's the measure of light energy. So is that 1700 lumens? It corresponds to about a 100-watt light bulb. Right now, I think it's set, yeah, defaults to 5,000. So let's cut that in half for starts. I'm going to move this down a little bit closer to this water plane I have here. And change the color on that. So generally with lights, or not generally, so from our real world experience, we all know that different colors of lights mean different things. Like red tends to mean alarm or emergency. Blue tends to be used for calmer things, or things like cosmic bowling. Something like if we go like kind of a sickly green color, we start to think of things like radiation or illness, or aliens, or just generally things that are unpleasant. Softer blues and greens make us think of things like water or just happiness and sometimes sadness. Um, Purple can be anything like a glowing energy source, or magic, or there are all of these uh, ideas that come to mind when we see different colors, and so we can use a lot of these to set the mood. And that's mostly important with point lights, because point lights are going to be used to simulate a number of different styles of lights. Like you'd use these to simulate a torch light, or a light bulb, or like really any light source that is going to generate light from uh, in a radius. And we're going to talk about that radius here in a minute. So I'm just going to go ahead. Let's make this kind of like a very odd green color. I like it. Okay. So attenuation radius is, we can't see it right now because it's set pretty big, but if I drop this down to 200, so our attenuation radius is the actual distance that this is the volume that light gets generated in. So if I move this to a wall, you can see that it starts to drop off near the edges, and as we get the light closer and closer and closer to an object, the light gets brighter and brighter and brighter. And in that way, these behave like more normal lights, where you have a relatively quick drop off in light. So let's make this a little bit bigger. I think 500 should fill this space pretty well, just for now. Okay, so yeah, that's looking all right. So we've got our light source radius here, and light source radius and the one below it, light source length, mostly affect the specular properties of the light. So I'm going to move this down a little bit closer to the water, and I'm actually going to bump the intensity back up just to make this more obvious. So here we can see that the light is being reflected in the water, and it's a fairly tight specular highlight. So by changing the source radius, I change the specular highlight across an object. And so this will let us, like if you have a lot of like metal or plastic in a scene, you can use this to get like nice long broad specular highlights across it. Now that works in conjunction with our source length here. And source length, the best way to describe this would be simulating uh, fluorescent lights. So if I set that to 500, you see we get this nice long light here, and then see what it did to the specularity here. And as I drive these numbers up, we're going to get less and less of a specular highlight, until eventually, mostly, it's just going to get washed out altogether. But if I drop this back down to like 250, notice we're getting a bit more of a specular highlight there. Let's actually jump this up to 128. Now it's so big it's in the freaking water. And now we have almost no specular highlight there. So generally with the light source radius, depending on what you're trying to do, 32 is probably as big as you need to go. In Unreal 3, 32 was what it defaulted to, and generally we actually drove it down to like 16 or 8, depending on what we were trying to do, because this was very expensive at the time. This is less expensive now. All right, so let's go ahead and set that back down to 0, and I like that. That's a good specular highlight. So we can use temperature here also. I don't. It's easier to use lumens. If you know what a standard 100 watt light bulb looks like, or like a 400 watt light bulb, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to figure out like a number for your intensity in lumens. And again, we have some of the same options here, like effects world, cast shadows, and indirect lighting intensity, which remember is just our global illumination. Now in our advanced options, we have some things that are unique to these lights. So I'm going to grab this one, and we're going to press Alt, and I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to change some of the settings real quick. I'm going to drop the attenuation radius down to 100. I might need to make it a little bit bigger than that. Let's go 250. And I just kind of want to move it out of the way, and I'll explain why in a minute. So this is probably a good spot for this. So the first option we have here is this inverse square fall off. And so what this really does here is just blasts out light. No, so this, let me turn this down to like 100. Okay, there we go. Now let's change the light fall off exponent down to like 5. No, let's drive that up actually. Let's go to like 20. So this is good for light painting, really. I can't think of many occasions where you would use this for actual lighting, but for if you have glowing things that don't have emissive, and you don't really want them to cast a lot of light, but you want them to cast some, or if you're trying to fill in an area with a particular color of light, or a good way to think of this is like a rim light. That's how you would use the inverse squared fall off. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. We'll jump this back up to 5 grand. So down under here, I said we'd talk about our roughness, and so now is probably as good a time as any to talk about that. So roughness also has to do with our specularity and our highlights. Hopefully we can see this. So if I come in here and start adjusting the minimum roughness, might need to actually do this over the water. I don't think I didn't set up any specularity on that landscape material, so we won't even be able to see this. Okay, so let's turn that back off. Or set that back to, what was it, 0.8? So now if we turn this down, like let's go down to 0.01, this will affect our specular highlight, and the higher we drive the number, like if I drive this up to like 0.9, it broadens out until the point where there is almost no specular highlight at all. So this is another way to kind of play with the highlights that you get from lights across objects. I did say that these two lights overlapping was going to be a little bit bad, and I will show you why right now. Let's duplicate a few more. And then just to make this super crazy, let's also take a spotlight. Cool, it's already working. You'll notice the red X around the spotlight right now. And then we've got another red X here. So let's look at why we have that. So Unreal changed the way lights worked in Unreal 4. In Unreal 3, directional lights were unless otherwise noted, the only dynamic light. You actually had to go check some boxes and things to make other lights dynamic. In Unreal 4, they've sort of changed what dynamic is, and that's these mobility settings here. So the very first one is static, which is exactly what it sounds like. No aspect of that light can be changed at runtime. You can't change the intensity, you can't change the location, the color, nothing. You can't turn on and off. It is what it is. The advantage to this, though, is that when you start the when you build your lighting, this bakes in all of your shadow maps, and once it's baked in, you never have to worry about it again. It has zero cost on performance, so you can set up really nice lighting and have like almost no impact. The only problem is that because it's static, it won't shadow dynamic objects. It's not casting shadows in real time. It has pre-computed shadows, so anything passing through that area is not going to be shadowed unless it was in that spot, like standing in one specific spot and had those shadow maps baked in, and then those would be baked in permanently on those areas. That's a bad way to handle that. And we can see what's going on here if I come up to lit and I change that to stationary light overlap. So I think I mentioned this in one of the first lessons. Anytime you see this, anytime you see anything that's not green or blue, it's bad, and especially if it gets to be this hot pink and white and red. This is really bad. And what this is these lights are overlapping, and so it's one, very expensive, and two, these stationary lights, as they're called. So this is the next one over. Stationary lights are dynamic lights. They are stationary, like it says, so they can't move, but they have some advantages of both static lights, or the station a static light or a movable light, in that um, their shadows get baked, but they also allow dynamic shadows on dynamic actors. So, for instance, if your player passes under something that casts cool shadows, it will cast shadows on them while still being able to bake in static shadows for all of the static assets that are in the level. They can be turned on and off. They can change their color and intensity. And the only downside is they can't be moved. So these are in between static and movable in expense, um, but they share some of the performance of both. And when I say they can be turned on and off or change their color or intensity, I mean at runtime. So we'll talk about we're going to talk about light functions here in a little bit, and we're actually going to make one that will make one of these lights flicker, and then we'll kind of see what I mean about at runtime, and if you're not certain what that means. So I'm going to clean this up real quick. Actually, let's just delete a few of these because we really only needed the one. One option there also would have been, if I don't need these lights to do anything, rather than deleting them, like if I did need them for lighting, rather than deleting them, what I could have done would have been to change them all to static, and then it wouldn't have been an issue. And I could do the same thing to this. This likely won't need to move. I'm going to go ahead and make it static right now. So this is a good time to move into our next light, which is the spotlight here. So our spotlight has a few different options than our other lights have had. Actually, I'm going to grab this. I want to shove this in here to make sure that I'm getting the effect that I want. Basically, I'm getting light from my directional light coming through here, but it's not really giving me the effect that I want. So I'm just going to have a spotlight streaming through this and hitting that puddle of water down there. Okay, so a few of the different things we have here are that weren't options for our other lights are we have an inner and outer cone angle. So outer cone angle is pretty self-explanatory. That's how tight the beam is. Let's position that a little bit better. I might need to drive that up a little bit more. So outer cone angle, let's go like 23 degrees. It looks like that fills that whole space up. Okay, good. So now our inner cone angle actually is only for shadows. Our inner cone angle, well, shadows and our highlight. Oops, wrong one. 23. So inner cone angle, let's make that like 15. So you can see our inner cone here. And adjusting this, what it will do is it one will give us a bigger hotspot, bigger or smaller depending on the size that we make it. When it was at 0, the light tries to evenly light throughout that, but it fades out towards the edges. Now, as I adjust the inner cone angle, it's trying to fade out from the inner cone angle to the outer cone angle, so you'll have the most intensity where your inner cone angle is, and then it will drop off quickly towards the outer cone angle. This also helps with shadows. If you're shining a spotlight on something and you're getting shadows and effects that you don't really like from it, then you can adjust that. So you can adjust the cone angle to get better shadowing in those areas. Move this in a little bit more. I don't think it's close enough. Oh yeah, there we go. Spotlights have kind of a termination point to where they won't light anymore. So in this instance, this isn't close enough to my ground plane, so it wasn't actually really casting any light on it. Now we're getting a little bit more, but it's hard to tell, so let's just delete our point light. We might need to drive the intensity up on that spotlight. I don't think 5,000 is actually enough here. We're going to go, let's go 8,000. Okay, so the next thing we should play with here is the attenuation radius. And this basically, what this is going to do is it's going to affect the light's visible area or area of influence. So making this bigger, like let's double this. Notice we've got more light now, so let's make that a little bit bigger. Let's go like 3,500. Alright, that's actually, I don't think we needed to do that. I think 2,000 was fine. 3,500 is way too much. Okay, source radius is what it sounds like. It's the radius of the light source. So if I go like 50, we get it's just like the light source radius on the point lights. It's just going to affect shadowing and how things are, how those shadows look as the light interacts with other objects. Just trying to get a little bit more shadow in here. Let's bump this up even more. 10,000. Inner cone angle, let's make 25. Outer cone angle, let's make 45. That's just like way too big. That's not even doing anything at this point. Now we're just getting, well, we're getting shadows at least. Let's set the inner cone angle to 20 and the outer cone angle to 25. Okay. And source length actually is just like source length on the point light. It's just going to affect the specular highlights on things. This just is not giving me the light that I want. Although that might be that we're still in preview and we haven't built the light. That's pretty intense, but let's go up even higher. I'm going to double that up to like 50,000. That's pretty bright. So now Okay, well, I think that will work for now. We kind of got some light streaming in through here. So the last light we haven't talked about yet is our skylight. And skylights are, it's almost a misnomer calling them a light. What they actually do is gather light from the scene, and these are another one of those lights where their position and scale and rotation don't matter. You can do anything you want with them. What these do is these actually gather light and color information from the rest of your scene, and then they use it to help fill out the rest of the scene more, and it fills in some of the darker areas. Let's get a few more lights in here. So I'm going to bring back our little point light friend that we had. Drop this down. Attenuation radius at 250. Light source radius of 16. Leave source length alone, and then let's just change the color on that. I want to go for, how about like a nice light blue color. That looks good. So I'll duplicate that across to the other side. And actually, let's just to be safe, let's go ahead and set these both as static. They don't need to be dynamic. They're not going to cast any dynamic shadows on anything. Their attenuation radius isn't large enough to be affecting anything like much outside their initial area. This actually looks like it'd be about a good size for a torch light. So back to our skylight. So our skylight does have some settings, just not very many, especially compared to our other lights. So we've got the two that we really need to worry about here are the source type. And so there's two source types. We can do an SLS capture scene, which literally it's capturing light and color from the scene, and then using that to fill in the darker areas. This actually works really nicely with ambient occlusion in your textures. It has a really nice effect. It helps kind of even out the roughness that we sometimes see in ambient occlusion, where sometimes the occlusion won't always agree on the direction it's coming from, if that makes sense. This will kind of soften the dark areas a little bit, and normalize them across the surface. It's a very nice effect. Alright, and let's just get one or two more of these lights in here. Oh, and a quick thing, just because static lights are cheap doesn't mean that you should just go crazy with them, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So once you've got lights set up, and notice it says preview everywhere. It says this because we need to actually build our lighting. So I'm just going to hit build. If you hit the drop down, there's a lot of things under there that you can build. BSP geometry lights, pathing and AI stuff. So I did say that I was going to talk about why not to go crazy with your lights. So one thing is I said at the beginning of the stream that lighting is something in games that we don't always necessarily use it to look realistic. Sometimes we like to use it for effect and to make things look nice or weird, or there's always a purpose behind it, not just so the player can see. And so one of the reasons you don't want to just go crazy with lights is you wind up washing out a lot of your shadows. Also, normal maps and direct light don't always play very nicely together. Intense light hitting a normal map on directly on its surface normal, or the surface normal of an object, will flatten out the normal maps. You'll lose the depth effect that you have. Especially if there's any specularity, because it will usually super intensely light across that surface. Is it done building? All right, it's done building. Getting some nice reflections and color from our sky and the water. All right, so oh, I forgot to talk about movable lights. We should do that real quick. Movable lights are completely dynamic. They can move. They always cast dynamic shadows. These render in real time in engines, so they're slow and costly. So be careful with them. Like if you're not familiar with lighting, dynamic lights and casting shadows, you should always choose lights that have the greatest effect. Like the whole reason for dynamic lighting is shadows. So if you're going to use them, and especially if you're going to use more than a few, use them for greatest effect and try and build your level around that. Like build things that cast neat shadows, especially on the player. It looks cool and it adds a lot of depth to the world. But these ones, so at runtime, we can have these move around a map. These can turn on and off. They're completely dynamic. They're really cool. They're also just very expensive. We're gonna leave that as a static light. So I never did talk about light functions, so we should actually do that. Light functions are a this is going to sound like gibberish, but bear with me because I will show you. Light functions are a material function for lights. So there's a number of things that we can do with them. Let me close some of these up real quick. Under rendering, nope. Oh, here we go. Light function. So to use a light function, we need to actually have one, and I've got one that I've already set up. So the process for this is the same as creating any material. I just went to new and material. However, when I created this, the first thing I did was I selected my node here, and I came over, and usually it's on surface, is the default, and surface won't work with lights. So I changed this to light function, and notice that now emissive color is the only thing that I have. So this is pretty simple, and I'll just run you guys through it real fast. So I used a time node, which you can find by typing time into your search box here. It's this guy. Just drag out and drop. I'm multiplying time by a parameter. This started out as a constant. For anybody who's curious, I hit 1 on my keyboard and left click, and it will create a single constant. And I gave it a default value of 1. Constants are great. Parameters are nice though because they allow you to make master materials, and parameters are things that you can adjust on the instance materials, which I promise we will talk about soon. So once I was happy with that, I decided I was going to change it to a parameter, and you can do that just by right clicking on it and going convert to parameter. And then you give it a name because that'll be important. So I'm multiplying those two things together by a sine wave, and then taking a fraction of that in order to get this flickery pattern. And so all of these you can find just by searching up here, like sine. Multiply, you can hold M as in Mike on the keyboard and left clicking, and you'll get a multiply. And frac is, if you typed in frac, then you totally got it right. Once you've done that, you hit apply and hit save. And then I can actually attach that now to any light I have selected that isn't a static light. Remember, static lights can't do anything. So see this little arrow here is grayed out. So even though I've got this selected, I can drag it over here, but it's not going to let me because this is a static light. So I'm going to change this to a stationary light because it doesn't need to move. I'm going to select this guy in the content browser and hit my little arrow, and now we get some flickering. So you can use this for like a TV static on a TV screen, or a torch is a great effect. Now that I have that on there, I actually want to turn the attenuation radius up a little bit. Let's go 400. Move that. A quick note, anytime you make any adjustments to anything, you have to rebuild your lighting. So anytime I move this light, it's changing shadows that are getting computed. So notice it says preview. That means I need to rebuild my lighting before I would be able to see this in engine. Like if I hop in here, let's get this closer to this back wall. I want to get some light back here too. I hope nobody's got epilepsy, and if you do, I'm sorry. So if I don't build that light and I just hit play, this is going to be so loud. Okay. Oh shit. Okay, it totally did it, although it says preview even in here. All right, cool. Well, that's good to know. Um, Although, always make sure that you've built your lights. You'll get better shadowing, your lights will look better, and you won't have preview written all over everything you have in your scene. So that does it for lighting. And if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to post them in the chat or on YouTube when this video goes up, and I'll be happy to answer them. By special request, next week we'll be covering particles in Unreal 4's particle editor, which means also a crash course in materials, since we can't cover one without covering the other. So next week's going to be a little bit busy. We'll probably do one day of materials and make the materials we will need for whatever particles we wind up making. And then the next day we would wind up putting those together and working with the particle systems. Anyway, thank you guys for watching and have a good night.